I want to get started with our first session this afternoon. I'd like to ask Sucharita and Peter to begin joining us. I think Sucharita is going to turn her camera on. I'm going to turn mine off. And thanks, Sucharita, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Scott. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to present. When I think about what is really happening and what does the new normal mean, it really means divergence. And what I'm saying when I point out the word divergence, it is that there will be those that are having bright futures and those that have many, many bleak futures, unfortunately. And that is the case across the entire retail ecosystem, whether we're talking about consumers, retailers, or brands. And I'm going to walk you through what I mean by this concept of divergence for each of those sectors. First, with consumers, we know that the pandemic has been catastrophic for those that are already the least well off. We know that the unemployment rate has been at historic highs, and that has very, very different implications for different demographic groups. And certainly the minority groups tend to be those with historically have had higher unemployment rates, but even worse through the course of the pandemic. But it's not just the employment rates, it's actually also the impact on health as well. And while a significant part of the attention has gone to younger consumers who the media portrays as going to bars and out publicly, that they've been those with the largest percent of cases, what should also be getting attention, and this is data from where I live in North Carolina, where a significant portion are also being affected who tend to be the same minorities. Just a piece to call out, 43% of Hispanics in the state of North Carolina are among those that are testing positive, whereas Hispanics are only 10% of the entire population. So really some important points that are getting overlooked. We also know that the most vulnerable also tend to be less concerned with issues related to the pandemic. We are seeing that they tend to be less worried that they may actually know somebody who may get sick, or less worried that they themselves may get sick. They're less worried that the government's response is too slow, or that, interestingly, they're on par with concerns around being able to get health care when they need it. On the other hand, we know that the more affluent customers are holding their own. And we see that certainly from an employment standpoint, but also from just an overall stock market and asset ownership standpoint too. Certainly we had a small setback in April with the market, but there's been a relatively significant rebound. And when you look at it historically, it's actually been pretty strong. And then when you're actually looking at the amount of spend across luxury, it is at levels which have almost recovered to pre-COVID levels. If you look at the sales of Porsche, for instance, the sales in the past month were the same as in February. When you look at the levels of sales that luxury stores like Louis Vuitton have been experiencing, those two are up by double digits year over year, not month over month. And then when we look at one of the biggest ways that consumers are able to purchase luxury, you look at universities, and they're continuing to charge full tuition, even though they have a subpar experience that they're now going to be offering their students. Now, on the retailer side, we also see this divergence. And while at the face of it, the pandemic has had almost no impact, there was the setback in April that took the industry back by about 5 years. When you look and dig deeper, there are, of course, significant variances, and the devil's in the details. We have department stores which are at decades-level lows, and this has actually been an ongoing downward sloping trend dating back to essentially the turn of the century. And then you have categories like restaurants, which have a similar trajectory to the overall picture, but what's different is that their variances are significantly bigger, so it's not just a 5-year setback, it's more like a 15-year setback in that case as well. And of course, other sectors like apparel and clothing stores also have been adversely affected, and will also need to figure out ways to continue to thrive. We have bankruptcies in nearly almost every week. A new retailer is announced to go into Chapter 11, and in some cases Chapter 7 as well. And this is likely to be a story and a trajectory that won't change anytime soon. But at the same time, we know that there will be, at the end of this pandemic, a number of retailers that will be much, much stronger. Grocers have been up in the double digits year over year, 13% for just the first 6 months of the year, which is astounding because this has been a flat, if not negative category for a number of years. Do-it-yourself stores also up double digits, and alcohol stores up over 20%. And the biggest winner of all, of course, are the online pure plays. And one thing to keep in mind is that the strongest of the retailers are in a position to actually exploit assets that they may not even think they realize they have, in part the eyeballs for solutions like advertising. And basically this chart is what consumers pay attention to of a dozen different advertising formats. What's really interesting is on the right-hand side are all the digital advertising formats, including the ones that most retail marketers tend to lean into, like Facebook and Google. Meanwhile, on the left side of the screen are the media formats that consumers are more likely to pay attention to. And the number one thing on this list that people are most likely to pay attention to are actually ads in physical stores. So when you're wondering what's the value of the Walmart and Target media networks, it's pretty incredible. So the third piece of divergence is really in the brands. And by brands, I mean those consumer-facing branded manufacturers. And on the one hand, we know that marketplaces are going to come out of the pandemic more strong than ever before. The usage of solutions like Amazon and Alibaba are at record highs, and more consumers plan to use those sites even after the pandemic is finished. But what we also know is that marketplaces dilute brands. Nearly 20% of consumers worry that marketplaces have poor quality or they have counterfeit products. And when we look at why do people shop on sites like Amazon, price is the number one reason. And there's a huge delta between the number one and the number two reason that people shop on Amazon, which is convenience. And at the same time, we know that brands are not just rolling over, and an increasingly large number are selling directly to consumer. You have sites like Dyson, which offer a half a dozen reasons to shoppers, telling them why a consumer should actually be purchasing directly from them versus from any of the other purveyors of their goods. And we also know that even for the essential goods merchants and for the essential products categories, sales are growing there too. And we, in our most recent survey, we found that 10% of consumers are purchasing directly from these websites, in large part because their ability to purchase from some of these larger multi-category sites means that they often don't get the variety of products, or the products are often out of stock these days. So what does all of this mean? And when we talk about divergence for consumers, what is likely to result is, and really the only thing to bridge the level of inequality, is to bring forward something that the Business Roundtable, which is a nonprofit, calls stakeholder primacy. And what that means is businesses built not for shareholders, but for constituents ranging from their customers to their employees to their communities. What that also means is that companies get rewarded finally for nearshoring and bringing manufacturing to the communities where they're actually selling goods. And finally, that means higher wages and more social programs that help to bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots. For retailers, we expect divergence to mean that dinosaurs will die and that speed ends up being correlated with survival. So those companies that are able to adapt the fastest, similar to the companies that we saw very, very quickly rolling out solutions like curbside, to be the ones that thrive. The new retailers are going to be the ones who are more nimble. They have asset-light platforms, often with fewer stores and smaller stores. And what we also know is that new business models like advertising in the stores that are left behind becomes really, really compelling. And finally, for brands, we all can expect that retail jobs in the future are going to be on digital teams of brands. sales organizations will be replaced by what we call e-control, which is the monitoring online of everything from gray market to counterfeit goods. And I expect every brand, regardless of whether it's essential or a high-ticket item, will see at least 10% of its sales coming from direct-to-consumer. This is my contact information if ever anyone wants to chat, and then I'm going to hand it over to Peter.
Thank you, Sucharita. Hopefully you can hear me now, right? So, when I look at what's happening in the market and the response of several companies, it actually reminded me of the Stockdale paradox. And Vice Admiral Stockdale was captured and held a prisoner of war in Vietnam for 7.5 years. And during this time, majority of his co-prisoners actually died. And when he was interviewed afterwards, and when he was asked, what are the traits of people that actually didn't make it out? His answer was very clear: the optimists. Those were the people that were expecting to be out by Christmas, and actually Christmas came, and another Christmas came, and actually many of them were dying from expecting to get out too early. So what's the learning from this? It's not about throwing out the faith. You actually have to retain the faith that you will prevail and you will get through, but you have to be able to confront the most brutal facts about your reality. And very often you can see that it's not the case. So we did joint research with Commerce Next, and you can actually download it in the handouts, so you would be able to go through everything there. But when you look at it, what are the two most common barriers to achieving success in e-commerce? Now, you can see that it's securing IT bandwidth and support and managing technology issues. Those are the top two. However, when you look at it and compare digital-first retailers and other retailers, you can see that those do not even make it to the top two for digital-first retailers. And that comes back to what Sucharita said in her presentation, that there will be actually many new winners and many new losers. And many of the current retailers have complex, systems, very old school, and they're not able to move forward. And because of that, the digital-first retailers are able to really get ahead. And actually, when you look at what's the first common issue of both of them, it's actually getting the unified customer view. And one of the things that you can see is that the digital-first are always ahead, and the other retailers are now playing a catch-up, and COVID made it just significantly stronger. Now, customer data platforms were the #1 priority, tech priority for companies pre-COVID. Now, what happened with COVID is it went down slightly, because you can see that there's more thinking about the short term, and you can see that the messaging and SMS platforms became #1. And the reason behind that is that during COVID, companies needed to communicate digitally, and they found out that they need to have more diverse set of channels to be able to reach them. And so they became much more tactical and started thinking short term. Another thing that you can see, as in every crisis, the short-term thinking is visible in here as well, where companies are shifting much more towards performance, although pre-COVID, many of them actually wanted to shift much more towards brand, which is the winning strategy in most of the times. And the most successful companies are investing much more towards brand than towards performance. Another one, very interesting finding for me was that COVID actually made companies be less concerned about privacy and security. And many companies are now claiming that they're investing minimal amount to be compliant. And from our experience, what we see very often when we start working with a brand, we actually find out that they're not at all compliant, not even close. And so it would be very interesting to observe over time how this will be changing. Now, for me, one of the most interesting findings that's coming from this survey, as well as from the research that we've done with our customers, is that companies are now focusing. We're trying to focus much more on acquisition before COVID. So pre-COVID, you can see that especially other retailers, but also quite a few digital-first companies were focusing on acquisition. When you compare that with post-COVID, you can actually see that there's a significant shift towards retention. And the reason behind that is that we've seen companies double, some even quadruple their online sales. However, this growth, only very small part of that growth was coming from the new customers that did not shop with them before. Most of the growth was actually coming from higher share of wallet of existing customers. And so it is about really understanding your customers and finding ways how to serve them digitally in a way that the customer experience is great and they want to shop with you. So what are the key takeaways from this? First is confront even the brutal facts of your reality. You know, there are big changes in the marketplace. Like Arcadia Group, one of our customers, actually is thinking about abolishing completely changing rooms in their stores. So that would be a massive change in the thinking of consumers, and we really need to think about what that means for you. The second thing is mid and to long-term thinking is a big competitive advantage. And it's really, really difficult because many companies are really constantly putting out fires. But many companies are still hoping that, you know, COVID will go away and things will go back to normal. And those companies are most likely going to die. And as Sucharita said, speed is very highly correlated with success. And then the third thing is customer retention is key to long-term success. And, you know, customer retention starts with really understanding the customer, being able to serve them in a personalized way through their preferred channel and serving them relevant content. So if you can make even the first, you know, 1 or 2 baby steps in this direction, that's your key to long-term survival. Thank you.